The man Bumpy Johnson feared was Adam Clayton Powell Jr. He was not a gangster. He didn't carry a gun or run a gang. But what he did have was exactly what scared Bumpy. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was Harlem's most powerful preacher and politician. He led the Abyssinian Baptist Church and later became a member of the U.S. Congress. Bumpy Johnson was the king of street power. But Adam Clayton Powell was the king of public power. Bumpy didn't fear bullets. He feared exposure. Powell had direct access to the media, police leadership, judges, and politicians. If Powell wanted, he could topple Bumpy's entire empire with just a speech or a phone call. Bumpy had survived things that broke other men. Sing Sing. Alcatraz. Years locked inside concrete and steel with killers who tested him daily, men who had no patience and no mercy. Every day was a lesson in survival, every whispered threat a chance to sharpen his instincts. He learned patience there. He learned timing. He learned that power wasn't just about muscle, it was about knowing when to move and when to wait. When he finally walked out of those gates, Harlem had changed, but Bumpy was ready. He didn't rule it with random bursts of violence or reckless intimidation. He ruled it with structure. Numbers ran smoothly, carefully organized under his watchful eye. Money flowed quietly, discreetly. Disputes ended fast, without unnecessary bloodshed. Even the Italian mob respected him, not because they feared bullets, but because Bumpy delivered profits without drawing heat, without bringing cops down on anyone. While other men polished their weapons and flexed their muscles, Bumpy read philosophy, history, and law. He understood that fear was useful, it kept men in line, but attention was deadly. Draw too much of it, and it could destroy everything he had built. And that's why this story matters. Because the man Bumpy feared didn't carry a gun. He didn't walk the streets with a crew or leave a trail of violence behind him. He carried something far more dangerous: influence, power, and the ability to move entire communities with a single decision. His name was Adam Clayton Powell Jr., a towering figure in Harlem politics. Powell was a congressman, a minister, and a man whose authority wasn't just local, it was national. While Bumpy controlled the underground, Powell controlled the pulse of the city. He could sway the vote, command media attention, and bring federal eyes down on anyone he wanted. And Harlem, for all its nightlife, music, and hustle, lived under his scrutiny in a way Bumpy could never fully predict. Bumpy understood politics. He understood how power worked in the shadows. But Powell's power was different. It was public, it was legal, and it was unbreakable in ways Bumpy couldn't touch with muscle, with money, or even with fear. Powell could rally communities, manipulate the press, and bend the law to protect, or destroy, anyone in his path. And Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was Bumpy's empire, his kingdom. And in his kingdom, the one man who could challenge him without lifting a finger was Powell. What terrified Bumpy wasn't a hit or an ambush. It wasn't betrayal from a rival gang or a sudden raid from the feds. What terrified him was the idea that Powell could wield his influence to dismantle everything Bumpy had built, to turn the community against him, to make even his allies think twice before siding with him. It was a fear Bumpy had never known, because no gun, no fist, no knife could stop it. And in the streets of Harlem, where strength usually spoke loudest, this invisible power whispered in a language only the smartest men could hear. Bumpy respected men who were smart. He respected men who could command fear without violence. And Adam Clayton Powell Jr., with his sermons, speeches, and political battles, was exactly that kind of man. From rallies in Abyssinian Baptist Church to tense committee hearings in Washington, Powell's reach was everywhere. Bumpy knew that a wrong move against him could bring the law down, bring the press down, bring the community down, all without a single shot fired. That was a weapon Bumpy had never faced before, and that was what made Powell truly dangerous. For Bumpy Johnson, survival had always been about knowing when to strike, how to negotiate, and how to maintain respect. But against Powell, survival meant understanding influence, patience, and the unspoken rules of power that didn't exist in the alleys or the gambling halls. And so, even the man who had stared down killers, prison guards, and the darkest nights of Harlem had learned something new. Sometimes, the greatest threat isn't someone who can take your life, it's someone who can take your world. Powell was a preacher, a politician, and the most powerful black public figure in Harlem. He wasn't just a man of words, he was a man of reach. He stood at the pulpit of Abyssinian Baptist Church and spoke to thousands, every sermon like a pulse running through the veins of the city. Later, he stood on the floor of Congress and spoke to the nation. Cameras flashed. Reporters typed. Senators listened. When Powell talked, newspapers listened. When Powell moved, City Hall reacted. When Powell decided someone was a problem, that person didn't get shot, didn't get beat, didn't get whispered threats in back alleys. They got exposed. Front page headlines. Sermons that painted them wrong. Federal eyes investigating every move. And in Harlem, exposure could be far worse than bullets. Bumpy Johnson understood exposure. He had survived every kind of street warfare imaginable. He had stared down killers with knives, men who wanted his head. He had survived prison, beatings, betrayals, and assassination attempts. On the street, you can handle violence. You can pay people off. You can scare witnesses. You can bury bodies. But you cannot shoot a headline. You cannot bribe a sermon. You cannot silence a federal investigation once it begins rolling downhill. Powell's power was daylight power. And daylight power lasts longer than the night. Night ends. Dawn comes. And Powell's influence was always waiting in the light. The two men lived in the same Harlem. They walked the same avenues, heard the same music, and knew the same faces. They shopped at the same stores, nodded at the same neighbors, and even passed by each other in the streets. But they operated in completely different worlds. Bumpy controlled what happened after dark, the clandestine numbers game, the underground gambling, the silent enforcement of rules through fear and respect. Powell controlled what people believed in the morning, their faith, their votes, their opinions, and ultimately, their behavior. And belief shapes law. What people believed determined who got protection, who got opportunity, and who got scrutiny. Bumpy knew that a man who could command belief could topple kingdoms without firing a single shot. A single speech from Powell could make an entire community rethink its loyalties. A single investigation, quietly planted in a reporter's notebook, could freeze operations and destroy reputations. Violence was immediate, brutal, and finite. Influence was slow, precise, and permanent. Powell's reach extended into every corner where Bumpy's money and muscle couldn't touch, and that was terrifying. Even for a man who had seen the inside of Alcatraz, who had faced men who wanted him dead every day, the idea of a power he couldn't see or grab was enough to make him cautious. And that caution changed Bumpy Johnson. He no longer moved through Harlem as if he owned every shadow. He calculated. He observed. He listened. Every word Powell spoke in the pulpit, every vote he cast in Congress, every community meeting he attended, it mattered. Bumpy had learned that surviving the streets was one thing. Surviving a city's daylight power was another. One controlled fear. The other controlled destiny. And in Harlem, destiny always had the final say. Powell knew who Bumpy was. Everyone did. He didn't need to name him, didn't need to point a finger or call a meeting. A sermon about crime, a speech about corruption, a demand for cleaning up the streets, and every man in uniform, every man in power, understood the message. Bumpy didn't have to hear his name, he could feel it. And he knew Powell didn't bluff. This wasn't a man who played games with threats. If Powell ever decided Harlem needed a public cleansing, it wouldn't be bullets in dark alleys. It wouldn't be a midnight ambush. It would be subpoenas, cameras, hearings, and names read aloud in pristine rooms, flags on the wall, pens scratching notes, and federal agents following every move. What shocked Harlem wasn't just that Bumpy feared Powell. It was what Powell owned. And what he owned was far more dangerous than any gun, any ledger, any vault full of cash. Powell owned legitimacy. He owned relationships with police commissioners, mayors, judges, and presidents. He owned influence that extended from the pews of Abyssinian Baptist Church to the marble floors of Congress. He owned the microphone on Sunday mornings and the spotlight on Monday afternoons. He owned the moral language of reform, the kind of language that could brand men guilty before a jury of peers had even met them. And in America, that language was lethal to men who lived off secrets, off the shadows, off the night. Bumpy's wealth was quiet. Cash stacked in hidden places, favors owed, debts remembered, safe houses known only to a trusted few. Powell's wealth was visible. Influence. Access. Authority. One phone call from Powell could summon 10 reporters and 20 investigators. One memo in his hand could start a chain reaction no street crew could interrupt. Bumpy could handle one rival gang. He could silence one traitor, one informant, one disloyal bookie. But he could not handle the federal government showing up at his door with paperwork, smiles, and cameras. That was a different kind of danger, one measured not in bullets but in exposure, in reputation, in survival itself. There were moments when Harlem saw the difference. When a local club owner got quietly advised by the authorities after Powell's speech. When a crooked politician suddenly found themselves in the press. When a street fight that would have been ignored was suddenly investigated, photographed, and publicized. These were small things to outsiders, but to Bumpy and the men who ran the streets, they were proof that Powell's power didn't need muscle, didn't need midnight strikes. It existed in the daylight, and daylight always lasted longer than the night. And Bumpy, the man who had stared down killers and survived the worst prisons America had to offer, learned to respect that kind of power. He learned that some battles weren't fought with guns or numbers. Some battles were fought with influence, access, and the ability to make the world watch while it judged you. And against that, even the king of Harlem had to pause, calculate, and think twice. When Powell held rallies or church events, Bumpy's men faded into the background. No collections. No confrontations. No noise. Even the whispers in dark corners paused. Bumpy didn't want his name whispered near Powell's shadow. That wasn't fear in the simple sense. That was survival intelligence. That was understanding the rules of a world he could not dominate. Bumpy knew when to be invisible, when to blend into the hum of Harlem without drawing attention. And the streets respected it. Harlem felt it too. The tension without words. A nod in Powell's direction could speak volumes. A sermon on justice, delivered without naming names, carried weight that rippled through every block. Two kings walking the same avenues, listening to the same music, breathing the same air, but never stepping on each other's territory. It was a Cold War built on mutual understanding, invisible lines drawn between pulpit and pavement. Powell didn't need to destroy Bumpy. Bumpy didn't need to challenge Powell. But both knew how the story would end if one forced the other's hand, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Bumpy once said prison didn't scare him. Death didn't scare him. Violence didn't scare him. What scared him was losing control. Powell represented that kind of fear, not through bullets, not through brute force, but through sunlight. Through records. Through history being written in ways that could not be erased. Every vote, every investigation, every headline was a weapon Bumpy could not hold in his hands. And yet, even knowing this, he navigated his world with the same precision, the same calm, that had kept him alive in Sing Sing and Alcatraz. As the years passed, Harlem changed. The old systems weakened. Federal eyes grew sharper. The streets grew louder, more impatient, more dangerous in new ways. Bumpy aged. His body slowed. His step was not as quick. But his mind remained sharp. He still walked the neighborhood, still commanded respect, still reminded everyone that the night belonged to him. But the era was shifting. Public power, the power of sunlight, of law, of reputation, was quietly winning over street power. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson died quietly of a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant. No ambush. No bullets. No betrayal. Just a man who had survived everything the streets could throw at him, leaving the world without drama, leaving behind a legend. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. lived on as a symbol of political force, brilliant, controversial, untouchable in ways gangsters never could be. He continued to shape the city, the nation, and the narrative itself, proving that influence, visibility, and respect could outweigh fear and violence. Harlem remembered both men. It remembered the king of the night, and it remembered the king of the day. But the lesson stuck deeper than stories or headlines. The most dangerous power doesn't wear a gun. It wears respect. It owns the story. It controls what people believe. Bumpy Johnson ruled the night. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. owned the day. And even the king of Harlem, who had faced every horror the streets could deliver, knew better than to fight the sun.